It's a book that we don't necessarily touch a whole lot, but we're going to be looking at the book of Habakkuk tonight, and it's not in its entirety. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we're going to take a look at the book of Habakkuk, and we're going to take some lessons from the book of Habakkuk. It's good to see everyone tonight. My name is Eli Tucker. I've known a lot of you for many, many years, but as I look out, there are several people that I have not met before, and I hope to get to meet you before the night's over. I'd love to shake your hand and introduce myself. I am the son of Dennis, so that's the family relationship that's going on there. Again, my name is Eli, and I'm here with my wife Laura and our two boys. We have a 4-year-old named Luke and a 2-year-old named Caleb. They're very energetic, but it's good to be with you guys tonight. And as I said, we're going to be taking a look at lessons from the book of Habakkuk this evening. Dad had asked me to preach tonight. He's had some various health issues going on the last number of months, and so some time ago he'd asked me to speak, and I was happy to have the opportunity to come and worship with all of you this evening. This lesson has its origins from a couple of years ago, where we attend up in Louisville. We live in Louisville, Kentucky, and we go to a congregation called Expressway up there. But a few years ago, me and several other individuals, we set out to teach a class on books of the minor prophets from the Old Testament. And one of the reasons why I wanted to teach a class on the books of the minor prophets, from the Old Testament on the minor prophets, was because I had never really studied them before in my life. I had never really looked at them. And it was kind of one of those things, well, if I sign up to teach a class on them, that's going to force me to take a look at them and kind of start learning from them. And when I went through that study, the book of Habakkuk is the one, all of them I came to appreciate far more than I had before. But the book of Habakkuk is the one, to me, that really became a favorite of mine. And I hope through our study tonight that you can see why, and maybe hopefully it can be a lesson or a story for you that hopefully builds your faith as it has mine, and helps us to persevere possibly through difficult times. Because in the book of Habakkuk, we're going to take a look at two key questions tonight. We're going to consider two key things. The first key question is it okay to question God? Is it okay to ask questions of God? Is it okay if you find yourself in a difficult situation where difficult things are happening and you don't know why they're happening? Is it okay to turn to God and say, God, why is this happening? Why are all these things playing out? Spoiler alert, the book of Habakkuk says, yes, it shows us that it is okay to ask God questions. However, how do we respond to God when he gives an answer we don't expect? That's the key part here, because if we're going to ask questions of God, if we're going to ask him, well, why is this happening? And we get answers we don't expect, we have to be willing to accept that. We have to be people that choose faith. And so we'll get into that more as we go through this study, but we're going to see Habakkuk ask questions of God, and God's going to answer Habakkuk directly, which is something we don't have. We have his word, but God answers Habakkuk directly, and Habakkuk is forced to make a choice. Habakkuk is forced to decide, is he going to trust God or is he going to doubt? And ultimately, Habakkuk chooses faith, and that's why I've come to love this book. It's because he chooses faith in the midst of difficult circumstances. So let's pause here for a second, or not pause here for a second. Let's jump into the book. We're going to take the book at kind of a high level and then take our application tonight. But we have this book. We're introduced to Habakkuk in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 1. So the first verse of the book just says, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. So some translations might say the message that Habakkuk the prophet saw. But basically, this is a message that Habakkuk was given from God to share to the people. And we don't know anything else about Habakkuk except the one detail that he's a prophet. We don't know where he's from. We don't know anything about his background, but we know he's a prophet from God, and he's been given this oracle. He's been given this message from God. And this message that we're going to see is really for three groups of people. The first group of people were the people around him. Habakkuk lived during the Old Testament. He lived in the southern kingdom of Judah. And so Habakkuk is writing this book to the people of Judah. He's writing this book so that they can read the story and they can understand what's going on. But he specifically wrote this to the righteous, to the people in Judah that were trying to serve God, because there were difficult things that were happening. And this book was meant to help encourage them through that difficult time. And then ultimately for us, the things that are recorded in the Bible, New and Old Testament, are recorded there to help us understand how to handle the struggles and the difficulties of this life. So the audience was the people on Habakkuk's day, but all the way down to us here in 2026. I nearly said 25, but it's 26 now. So when was this book written? Well, this book was written a very long time ago. It was written roughly between the years 612 to 606 BC. And I'm a history dork, so this is the part where I could really take the sermon into a tangent and get into all the history of this. But here's why that date is important. And you don't have to remember the date. You just need to remember what's going on in the world that Habakkuk's living in. Habakkuk is living in these years, and what's happening in these years are the following. The kingdom of Judah finds itself in between two great powers in the world. To the south and west is Egypt, and to the north and east is Babylon. And Egypt and Babylon are fighting, and Judah is in the middle. They're caught between a rock and a hard place. So that's what's going on in the world that Habakkuk's living in. You've also had in these years a guy by the name of Josiah. Josiah is the last good king of Judah. Josiah was a great king of Judah. He loved God. He was trying to serve God. But Josiah has died. He dies in these years. And Josiah's descendants are wicked. They're not good people. As we'll see, they're not doing good things. So Habakkuk's living at a time when there's these great political storms, these great tumults about to happen. And the kingdom that he's living in is dealing with wickedness, and the leadership is corrupt. And Habakkuk, this is distressing to him, as one could imagine. And so this is what we're going to deal with tonight. We're going to look through the book of Habakkuk, and the book breaks down into a fairly simple outline. The first few verses of chapter 1, Habakkuk is going to ask God a question. He's going to ask several questions, but really those several questions can be summarized as one great question. And then the rest of that chapter, most of the chapter, God's going to give a response. God's going to answer Habakkuk's question. And then Habakkuk is going to ask a second question. And then God is going to give a second response. So it's a conversation. The first two chapters of Habakkuk are a conversation between God and Habakkuk. And then chapter 3 is a little bit different, though, because I'm calling it Habakkuk's Song. It's a poem that he wrote. It's something that Habakkuk wrote in response to this conversation. So that's the outline, and that's what we're going to go through tonight. So we're going to go back to Habakkuk chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 1 through 4, and we're going to take a look at a high level of the question that Habakkuk is asking, and then we're going to kind of look at the specific things that Habakkuk is distressed about. Because he has one basic question, and the basic question is, God, why are you letting bad things happen? That's the key question, kind of, if I can summarize it in my own words, that's the key question that Habakkuk is asking God here. So let's read Habakkuk chapter 1. We're going to read verses 2 through 4. This is Habakkuk talking to God. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear me? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. So this is the entry to the book of Habakkuk. As you can tell, it's a real uplifting book from the tone that's said here. But I say that jokingly, but you can read through these verses, you can sense the despair, the angst, the sadness that Habakkuk is feeling, because his basic question, again, as I can summarize it, is, God, why are you letting bad things happen? And specifically, he has 6 different things that he talks about in these 4 verses, and we'll hit them just real quick. The things that are upsetting Habakkuk are this: how long will I call for help, and you seemingly do not hear me? That's verse 2. Verse 2, again, I cry out, there's violence. I'm seeing terrible things happen, and you could take it away, but terrible things are happening. Verse 3, I see evil and you could take it away. Verse 4, the law is being ignored. The law that you've given your people to follow, people are just casting it aside. And not only that, number 5, justice is not upheld, it's perverted. When something bad does happen, rather than the felon being prosecuted, it's the innocent that are taken advantage of. And finally, the righteous are surrounded by the wicked. So these are the questions that Habakkuk brings to God in Habakkuk chapter 1. And if I look at those questions and I think about my life, well, I think for myself, I know for myself, there are times that I can certainly relate to Habakkuk. And maybe you can too. Maybe there are times in life when you look at the situations that happen in life, you look at the world around us and see what happens. There are times that we can feel this. We can feel that terrible things are happening, maybe around us or to us, and we don't understand why that's happening. And that's exactly where Habakkuk is. And that's why I like this book, because I find that Habakkuk's questions are relatable. I find that what he's asking, I can relate to, and hopefully you can as well, that you can see where he's coming from, because these are the things that are happening in his world. These are the things that he's seeing with his eyes. And so there's an important point to note here, though. Habakkuk asks these questions of God, but we have to ask ourselves, is the fact that Habakkuk is raising these questions, does this represent a lack of faith on Habakkuk's part? Does this mean that Habakkuk has a lack of faith in God? I would submit to you that it does not. I would submit to you that Habakkuk is a person of faith, and here's why. Here's why I would say that. First off, how can we tell that Habakkuk is a person of faith? First, does Habakkuk believe that there is a God? Does Habakkuk believe God exists? Well, I think we have to say yes. Otherwise, why would he even be asking the questions? So Habakkuk believes that God exists. And more to the point, he believes that God has the power to solve these problems. He believes that God has the power to take away these issues and to deal with them. So it's not so much that Habakkuk lacks faith, it's that Habakkuk does not understand seemingly why God isn't acting, why God isn't doing something. It's a problem of perspective that Habakkuk has. He doesn't understand why God isn't responding. So this isn't a lack of faith, this is just a lack of understanding. And again, I think we can relate to that because we, as Christians, we believe in God. We believe He exists. We believe that He's powerful. But there are times that we think to ourselves, well, why is this being allowed to happen? Why is the world allowed to be the way that it is? But it's because of a lack of being able to comprehend where God is coming from. So those are Habakkuk's basic questions. He's asking, why are terrible things allowed to happen? And so the amazing thing about Habakkuk is that God responds. He responds, and the basic summary of God's response, we're going to take a look at here, but again, to put it into my own words, is that God is not just letting things happen. He's not just standing by and doing nothing. He has a solution. So we're going to take a look at Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, and see how God responds to Habakkuk. Because God has a solution to the problem. It's just not one that Habakkuk expects, and it's certainly not one that Habakkuk likes. So let's take a look at verses 5 through 11 and see what God says. He says to Habakkuk, "Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if I told you. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. The horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God." So we'll break these verses down and see what God is saying to Habakkuk in detail. But at a high level, what God is saying is, I am not standing by. I'm going to use a group of people called the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are the same thing as Babylonians. I'm going to use the Babylonians, and they're going to solve the problem. All of the terrible things that you see, Habakkuk, that are happening around you, this country of Babylon, it's up to the northeast, they're going to come, and they're going to wipe things out, and there's going to be no more problem because your society is not going to exist any longer. Your country is no longer going to be a country. That's what God is essentially saying in these verses. He tells them the problem is going to be solved because your kingdom is going away. So, does God know that this answer will surprise Habakkuk? Habakkuk has said, there's terrible things going on, God. Why do you allow them to keep happening? And God says, I'm not doing nothing. I'm going to use Babylon to destroy your country. God knows that Habakkuk is going to be surprised by this answer. Have you ever had an event in your life where something crazy happens? You watch something happen and you're like, that is crazy. And someone comes up to you later and they ask you, what happened there? Like, you were there, what happened? And you start off by telling them, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. Have you ever done that to someone? Like, listen, I'll tell you, but you won't believe me because it's too crazy. I love this because that's exactly what God does here to Habakkuk. He says here in verse 11, I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe me if I told you. He kind of prefaces Habakkuk like, hold your horses, man. This is not the answer you expected. And I love that little detail of how that's phrased. But he says that the Babylonians are coming. And you go through these verses and you look at how God describes the Babylonians. There's nothing good in here. Verse 6, he says they're bitter and hasty. Verse 7, they're dreaded and fearsome. Verse 8, they're swift and proud. Verse 9, they're violent. Verse 10, they're scoffers. Verse 11, they're guilty. So you look at this and you think, does God list anything redeeming about these Babylonians, these Chaldeans? He does not. God knows that the Babylonians and the Chaldeans are terrible. He's not looking at the situation with rose-tinted glasses. He declares them guilty before that even begins. But he's using Babylon as a means to an end. Habakkuk is right. The country that he lives in, the society that he lives in, is terrible. It's beyond the point of being redeemed, if you will. So God has a solution. It's just not the solution that Habakkuk wants or wanted. So that's what God presents here in chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. So you get Habakkuk's second round of questions. And we're going to see how Habakkuk feels and how he responds to this. We're going to look at chapter 1, verses 12 through chapter 2, verse 1, and take a look at how Habakkuk responds with his second question, because we're going to see that Habakkuk, now that he's gotten his answer, he asked a question, he got his answer, now he's confused. He's afraid. He's upset. He feels worse. he doesn't like the answer. Now he's worse. So he says in verse 12, Habakkuk now, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. You have ordained them as judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. He's talking about the Babylonians. You have ordained the Babylonians for judgment. You have established them for reproving us. Verse 13, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings them all up with a hook, and he drags them out with his net. He gathers them in with his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to a net and makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself in the tower. I will look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So, again, we'll break this down and we'll take a look at what Habakkuk is saying here. But the general summary is that Habakkuk has received an answer. He's confused, he's afraid, and he's upset. And so he starts off his next his next round of questions, his next question with a statement of fact. In verse 12, he says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One?" So he starts off with a statement of fact. He starts off with a statement of faith. He says, "You, God, are everlasting. You're holy. I believe in you. I know you understand what's going on." But then he is also, he knows that God's in control, but then he's also shocked. He's also appalled, because here at the end of verse 12, he says, Why are you doing this? How have you ordained them? How have you ordained the Babylonians as a judgment? How have you picked them to be the one that comes in and judges us? And how have you established them for reproof? And he says in verse 13 specifically, he says, how can you remain silent, at the end of verse 13, how can you remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? What Habakkuk is saying is there is, God, the Babylonians are worse than us. How can you use the Babylonians coming here and punish us when they're worse than us? And I really like Habakkuk. He's a great guy. But this is where the problem, this is the crux of the problem in Habakkuk's life. Habakkuk has made this assessment. Habakkuk is the one that thinks that Babylon is so much worse than Judah. Habakkuk is the one that thinks this is terrible. Habakkuk is the one that doesn't understand. And that's okay. That's okay for us to not understand at times. That's okay for Habakkuk to not understand exactly what's going on here. But when we find ourselves, when Habakkuk, we'll see what he does, when he finds himself in a point when he doesn't understand. And what we need to do when we find ourselves in life and points when we don't understand, we have a choice to make. Are we going to trust God, or are we going to be doubt? And Habakkuk is going to come away from this, and he's going to choose faith ultimately. But he doesn't understand. He's afraid. He's confused. And his basic question, we'll jump down here to verse 17, because this is the real heart of his question. In verse 17, he says, Habakkuk's talking about Babylon, is Babylon to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? What Habakkuk is asking is, okay, God, you've said that Babylon is going to do this. Are you just going to let Babylon get away with it? Are you just going to let them keep on doing terrible things forever and ever and ever? That's Habakkuk's question. Is Babylon going to keep on going forever? And Habakkuk ends his question with this statement in chapter 2 that I think is important, because he's been asking questions of God. He's confused. He's upset. But in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, Habakkuk talking about himself. He says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what God will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. Another translation says, the New King James, I'm reading from the ESV, the New King James Version says, when I am corrected. I'm going to see how I respond when I am corrected. And I think that's the right attitude. There are times in life when we're confused, when we find ourselves in difficult spots, and we don't understand why God is letting things happen the way they are. When we find ourselves in those moments when we don't understand, we have to be humble enough to say, I don't see the full picture. I don't fully understand what's going on here. I'm going to trust that God knows what's going on. And that's what Habakkuk is saying here. He's saying, I don't understand the full picture, but God does. And so the rest of chapter 2 is God's response. We're not going to read all of chapter 2 for the sake of time. But at a high level, what God says is, Babylon is not going to be allowed to keep on doing this forever. I'm answering your question, Habakkuk, and the answer is no. Babylon is not getting away with this. And so he says that in chapter 2, verses 4 through 5. 4 through 5. 2 through 5 is what 2 through 5 is what we're going to take a look at, actually. 2 through 5. The Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold his soul, that's talking about Babylon. Behold, Babylon's soul is puffed up. It is not right within him. But the righteous shall live by faith. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol, like death he is never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. So What God is saying here in chapter 2, verses 2 through 6 is no, Babylon's not going to get away with it. It's going to take time, but you can take it to the bank that Babylon is not going to get away with this because he's proud. In contrast, verse 4, the famous phrase from the book of Habakkuk is chapter 2, verse 4, the righteous shall live by faith. People that are righteous have faith, they trust God, and they put their trust in Him. So the rest of chapter 2, we're not going to read it specifically, but the rest of chapter 2, God goes through and He pronounces woes upon Babylon. There are 5 different woes, 5 different things that God says Babylon is guilty and they're terrible and they're going to be judged for these 5 things. To give you a flavor of this, we'll just read chapter 2, verse 12 to give a flavor of what God says about Babylon. He says, woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So that's just a taste of it. Woe to him who builds a town with blood. That was Babylon. They built their town on blood. So what we have here is Babylon will be punished in time. And you can ask God any question. You can bring anything to God if you are willing to accept the answer. If you're willing to humble yourself and say, I'm going to accept what's happening here and take that. So what we have here is chapter 3. The end of chapter 3 is my favorite part of the whole book because chapter 3 is a poem. It's an expression of concerns and faith. It's both expressing concern and it's an expression of faith. I am typically not a person for poetry. That's not my cup of tea. Give me a nice, dry, boring book on a bridge or a road project somewhere, and I could probably that will keep me up. Laura can tell you, poetry is not my thing. But I love this poem. I love how this ends because what this is, it's an expression of concerns, but it's also an expression of faith. Verse 1, there's this term. Well, we'll read 3 verse 1. It says, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to Shoiganoth. We don't know what the word Shoiganoth means, but it probably just means some kind of instruction about the type of song that it is. So we sometimes sing songs that are upbeat. We just sing an upbeat song. We're marching to Zion. That's a great upbeat song. But sometimes we sing songs that are just slow and sad. Night with Embedded Pinion, that one, talking about Jesus before going to the cross. That's a sad, slow song. And I think probably what Habakkuk is saying here is this is a slow, sad song that he's expressing. We're not going to read all of chapter 3, but what we have here in this poem basically is in verses 2 through 5, Habakkuk starts his poem by remembering what God has done for his people in the past. It's poetry, so it's not like he's giving a complete historical recounting of what God has done. But in 2 through 15, he remembers what God has done for his people. And specifically, the part that sticks out to me is verse 11, talking about what God has done for his people. In verse 11, he said, the sun and the moon stood still in their place, and at the light of your arrows as they sped, and at the flash of your glittering spear. I think that's a reference to Joshua chapter 10, when God held the sun and the moon still as the people of Israel were capturing the land of Canaan. God literally for a day stopped the moon and the sun and caused the day to last longer so that his people could go and conquer the land. I think what Habakkuk does here, he finds himself in a moment of concern and doubt. So he looks back at what God has done for his people. He remembers the great things that God has done. But then he also, in verse 16, he expresses how he feels about the situation. Here's what Habakkuk says, thinking about what God has told him, that Babylon is coming for his country and it's going to wipe them out. It says in verse 16, Habakkuk talking about himself, I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will wait quietly for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. God's told Habakkuk terrible things are going to happen, so Habakkuk is physically impacted. It says here his body trembles. Rottenness enters into his bones. His legs tremble beneath him. Habakkuk is looking at terrible things in the future. He's asked questions of God, and God has told him terrible things are coming, and this is physically impacting Habakkuk. And I think it would the same thing for any of us. But the key part of this book is verses 17 through 18 and 19. This is the hard part of the book of Habakkuk. This is the hard part for me and for anyone. Because Habakkuk has all of this information now, and he doesn't like it, but he has a choice. Is he going to trust that God knows what God's doing, or is he going to doubt? And so Habakkuk finishes by saying this: though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no fruit. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choir master with stringed instruments. There's a key phrase that comes up a couple of times in these verses. And that phrase is, I will. In verse 17, Habakkuk talks about, he basically describes the end of the world. You know, if you're looking at a world where the fig tree doesn't blossom, there's no fruit on the trees, there's no olives, the flocks aren't there, that's the end of the world. And that's what Habakkuk is facing. He's facing the end of his world. The temple is coming to an end. Everything he's ever known is about to be washed away in war. That's what verse 17 is saying. But yet 18, he says, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. He is choosing faith. I will is a very hard thing. I will in the face of trouble and trials is challenging. It's maybe the hardest thing as Christians that we ever face. But in those moments you choose faith because, verse 19, God is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. So as we kind of end tonight, there's a couple of key things to think about. Our questions were, is it acceptable to ask questions of God? I think Habakkuk says that yes, we can. We can ask God anything. We can ask God, why am I sick? Why is this happening? We're not going to get a direct answer like Habakkuk. But we can ask God questions if we have the right attitude. If we have an attitude that is willing to accept the answer. If we choose faith. So from an application standpoint, real quick, and then the lesson will be yours. How will we respond in life? There are certain events that happen in life that they don't happen to everybody, and thankfully they don't happen to everybody at the same time or on the same day. But how will I respond? Or how will you respond if you have a business or if you work somewhere and that business fails? You no longer have a job. You no longer have employment. How do we respond in those moments? Is it distressing? Absolutely. Is it a moment of concern? Absolutely. Is it a moment where we might feel fear? Absolutely. But in those moments, do we choose faith or do we choose doubt? Do we choose faith that God will carry us through those moments? Or do we let that be a moment where we stumble? Maybe when a loved one dies. Maybe when someone close to us dies. That's a moment where we can ask questions like, maybe it's suddenly. Maybe it's a young person. Maybe it's someone we love dearly. And we're left thinking to ourselves, why was this allowed to happen? Why would God let this happen? That might be the question we ask. How do we respond in those moments? Do we choose faith like Habakkuk or do we choose doubt? We have to remember that God is faithful and we have to choose faith. When I pray for people to be saved, and maybe they don't obey the gospel, maybe that's something that's a challenging situation. You don't understand why that's happening. Do we choose faith or do we choose doubt? And maybe most importantly, this is the one that's going to hit all of us eventually. When our health fails, when things are not going the way we want them to go, do we take that moment to say, all right, I don't understand what's going on here, but I'm going to choose faith. I'm going to choose to understand that God is in control. He's taking care of me, and he's taking care of the ones around me. Because those are moments that happen in life. All of these are. Certainly, all of us will face the moment when our health will fail and our life will be at an end. And we need to be ready for that day. We need to be ready for those times. So we have not talked about the story of Jesus in detail tonight, but what we can say is this, that the greatest reason that we have for trusting in God is because what he did for us through the sacrifice of his Son upon the cross. We can trust God because he was willing to send Jesus to this earth to die for us, to redeem us from the sins that we have put ourselves in, to suffer a terrible death upon the cross so that we can live. That event alone is enough and should be enough to make us to help us understand that we can trust God, that we can put our faith in him in no matter what circumstance we are. So if you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, or if you're a Christian that's been struggling with doubt and issues and you need the support of this group, or if you're ready to obey the gospel, we are ready to help you and willing to aid you and to wash away your sins through the waters of baptism if you will come forward as we stand and sing.